Okay. Okay, I just checked. We need to wait for a while. Very quickly, they can have this broadcasting ready. So we need to wait a few seconds. Okay. Just some technical problem there. Yeah, looks like.
Professor Shi, we can start the both broadcast start.
It's ready now, right?
It's ready
Okay.
now. Yes.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. Okay. Good evening from Hong Kong. Dear friends, welcome to this webinar on urban informatics. I'm Zhong Shi from the Hong Kong Polytechnic University. Let me first start to introduce urban informatics in general, and then we have speakers, Professor Goodchild, Professor Batty, Professor Kwan, Professor Miller, and Professor Ratti, and then introduce each part on urban informatics, so we can have a full picture on urban informatics. So why do we need urban informatics? So I think we have a number of urban issues to be resolved. Traffic congestion, environmental pollution, housing, urban disaster, and public health issues like COVID-19 pandemic we have right now, and aging issue, urban heat island, etc., etc. So that's on from the real application point of view. Scientifically, we have a number of questions related to issue urban to be solved and answers. So for example, urban discovery, prediction, and explanations. So we need to discover and explain the human behavior and the regularities in the context urban, spatially, temporally, and dynamically. Explain cities' evolution and predict the trend of future city development. And see, for example, what will be the future city development in the year of post-pandemic. And we also have a number of issues about uncertainties in urban big data, and also representation of spatial data on urban. So urban informatics is an emerging discipline. It is a transdisciplinary approach, including urban science, informatics, geomatics, and many others. And the approach helps us to understand, manage, and design the city using systematic theory and methods based on new information technology. And computation is one of the central. Let's talk about urban science. It's about people and place in city and their relation, and which are specifically by flow and network. And this is urban informatics. People carry a laser scanner and moving along this building and compute the virtual city compared with the real city. So that's called a digital twin, or more recently, metaverse. So the information technology to support the metaverse, blockchain, explainable AI, feature learning, edge computing, and AI-based IoT, and quantum computing. So that's where the new computer technology can support us in the urban studies. So geomatics is a full range of sensing technology from satellite, aircraft, and UAV, vehicle-based sensors, even for underground and underwater. So involving geomatics technology have a geo AI, high-resolution satellite images and laser scan data, spatial data infrastructure, such as a high-definition map for autonomous driving, and also GPS-based digital urban services. So dimension of urban informatics include urban sensing based on the sensing technology, urban spatial big data infrastructure, and then we do the computation on the basis of data we obtain and find the regularities and the trend of the city for which forms the urban size. And then the size of our urban size and further support urban applications in a very wide range. So urban informatics is a foundational science and technology for smart city. So we have the urban issues to be solved by spatial information technology and to support a wide range of smart city like mobility, environment, living, governance, economy, and people. So for the future, the traffic congestion can be resolved or partially resolved by the autonomous driving, shared mobility, and the connectivities. And the environmental pollutions can be solved or monitored by satellite images with image processing and wide implementations of EVs. Urban disaster can be managed with AI, with supported satellite image cognition. This is a landslide we recognized from AI-based solution, deep learning. So the solution can improve the efficiency of landslide monitoring by 6 times. Public health, the spatial data, mobility, and also other medical related data can be used for the prediction of the COVID-19 for the city, like in Hong Kong, 291 cities, regions for the city. Then it will prediction spatial distribution of COVID-19 in city. Housing, so the satellite image and other technology can be used to monitor the land use and future land development. So for the development of urban informatics, then we start with this journal, Urban Informatics. So you are welcome to submit your papers on urban informatics to that journal. Then we publish book, Urban Informatics, with 957 pages and open access, so you can download this book for free. So I understand there are over 800,000 volumes being downloaded so far. So we formed an international society, so you are welcome to join our big family and on urban informatics. So we had a conference in 2017-19. So after pandemic, let's meet again through this international conference in urban informatics. Education. So from international view, you will see MIT, Shenzhen University, and UCL, and PolyU, and many others from urban informatics related program. So you can see the urban informatics is widely used, adopted by education community. I understand our book, Urban Informatics, being recognized as a reference book for this program in MIT. So urban informatics supports the smart city, which is with large potential. So US dollar 400 million in 2020 and 900 billion in 2027. So this is a very significant industry for the future. So with that, I conclude my brief introduction. Thank you. So let's then move to the second speaker. Is Professor Michael Batty.
Okay, I'm just going to share my screen. Everybody can hear me.
Yes.
Okay, let me just go back to the beginning of the PowerPoint. Apologies for that. Okay, well, as John has said, there are several different perspectives on urban informatics, and we're dealing in this webinar with 5 or 6 of these different perspectives. And it's inevitable that the perspectives will interact with one another. So I'll be talking about urban science, but at the same time, there are quite extensive implications for what we might define as urban science for a whole range of other things. So, for example, I think last but not least, Eric Miller is going to talk about urban computing, and many of the models in urban computing, of course, could be argued to be part of urban science. So what I will do is I'll begin by talking really about the need for theory in developing models of urban systems. Theory is very important because to some extent all our models imply theories of various sorts, and the evolution of many models in urban science really has their roots in quite detailed theory. And the theories involve specifically, and this is not an exhaustive list by any means, social physics, which emerged in the last 100 years and so on, in analogy with some statistical physics and gravitational theory and so on, regional science, which brought in input-output modeling, econometric modeling, urban economics, that's a very important theoretical perspective in terms of thinking about how land markets work, markets generally in space, transportation, and indeed Mei-Po, Kwan, and Eric certainly will talk about transportation. Indeed, transportation and transit really run throughout this. Demography, urban growth theory. These are really the perspectives that we bring to bear in something that we could define as urban science. So let me try and define it in certain contexts. That loosely, I suppose, the term urban science is much more associated with one or two of these themes. So, for example, associated with social physics, really, in that sense. And to some extent, the way it's emerged in its narrower context is with respect to statistical physics, and to a lesser extent with respect to theories of utility, which are really part of microeconomics in that sense. There's also a very strong push in urban science from the development of complexity theory, the idea that we need to look at the world from the bottom up as well as the top down in that sense. And that, to some extent, over the last 50 years has replaced the systems approach, which is looking at systems of cities and cities themselves from the top down, really, in this sense. So complexity theory is important in this sense. And one of the major frameworks which comes out of complexity theory and statistical physics involves scaling. And this is particularly important because you can often open an article which alludes to urban science, and it's really all about scaling. Scaling is how cities change qualitatively. It's actually how any sort of sets of objects change qualitatively. And as they grow, for example, and change, they change in shape and size. And this leads to different types of behavior in the human realm, different structures in terms of, in the biological and physical realm in that sense. So the focus in urban science is fairly physical. It's strongly spatial in that sense. That doesn't mean to say that it doesn't relate to a whole range of social and economic factors in a sense. So let me actually begin by just throwing some of the key models onto the table. There are many, many things I could say in this talk, but I'm just going to really look at 3. And those 3, in fact, are going to deal with, first of all, scaling, and say something about scaling because it's become so important. I want to also say something about cellular urban development, cellular automata, because to some extent, that's the model par excellence, if you like, of a complex system which grows from the bottom up and which actually produces emergent phenomena. Also relates to the historical development of cities in that sense, or indeed any objects to which CA are actually applied. And then last but not least, questions about system and their environment, the whole question of aggregation. So these three topics, as I said, are no means exhaustive of urban science. They're in fact little kind of snapshots of bits of urban science, scaling, CA, and systems and their environment. So let me just show three sets of examples in that sense. Let's begin with scaling. Now, I said that there's qualitative change as cities change in size. So as population rises in cities, as we go from small towns to metropolitan areas in that sense, and then to megacities, basically, we'd expect changes in size. I mean, one very obvious thing is that you tend not to get subways in cities, mass transit of that kind, in cities which are less than about 2 or 3 million, basically. In this particular context, this is simply a resource question, but it's also a question of movement and the efficiency of movements and the shape of cities in that sense. So this is what we mean by qualitative change, changes in area, economic activities, social interaction. And the basic relationship, which is quite widely used, this appears in economics, as economies of agglomeration, this relationship, and also in biology as allometry. And it simply says that some quantity, let's say, for example, in an economic system, income is proportional to population. That's what the equation says, but proportional to population, but raised to a power which may be greater than 1, or indeed less than 1. Greater than 1, for example, would imply economies of agglomeration. It would, in allometry, it's called positive allometry. And if it was less than 1, it would be negative allometry, and it would lead to diseconomies to some extent, or it would lead to economies which are less than linear in that sense. So we often refer to the relationship as developed for city size as being a superlinear relationship, with the implication that the parameter alpha is greater than 1. So the key, I've just said this, the scaling parameter alpha can be greater than 1 positive allometry or less than 1 negative allometry. And there's a strong mapping onto questions of economies of scale and diseconomies of scale, agglomeration, if you like, in economics in this particular context. There are many similar relationships that float around urban science in that sense. They're all really built from this basic, simple allometric relationship. So the one that may be familiar with many people who've worked in transportation particularly is the notion that we have an interaction model of this kind, where, for example, we have a variety of parameters, all of which are scaling. The ones in the circles, the positive allometry, if you like, are in population, alpha and beta, and the deterrence parameter on some form of distance or travel cost and so on. And then K is still an important parameter of scale. In fact, a typical scaling parameter in terms of our immediate and naive knowledge of scaling in that sense, adjusting the units in some sense in that sense. So this is, many models can be derived from putting together questions about scaling in different ways in that sense. Not going to say any more about that, but that's a very central plank to urban science. And in our book, basically in the edited book, I should say, I kick off the section on urban science by talking a little bit about scaling in that sense. A second aspect is cellular development. I mentioned that complexity theory is driving our field very strongly at the present time, has been really for about 20 years or more. And the idea that things grow from the bottom up, that cities are products, for example, of millions and millions of relatively uncoordinated, I don't mean that in a chaotic sense, but uncoordinated decisions, which lead to emergent phenomena. Cellular automata models are probably the simplest models that have been developed over the last 20 years to do this in a sense. And here are some examples of cellular automata models that generate shapes which are referred to as fractals sometimes. And you can actually see, I'm not going to explain that, but on the left-hand side, those are different neighborhoods that if I were to unpack them and spend 5 minutes talking about how they worked, you would see that it would lead to structures of that kind. So any kind of structure can be seen in terms of how local operations in terms of development in local neighborhoods lead to these sorts of structures. And on the right-hand side, you can see an example where we had to go at seeing how the growth of Cardiff in this particular context in South Wales appeared over a period of time in that sense. I should also say that the other main thing, and Eric may mention this a bit later on, because I know he's worked extensively on agent-based models. If we think of agents as sitting on top of cells in that sense, then we see a lineage that is quite well mapped out now in terms of the development of spatial agent-based models in that sense. Okay, so that's my second aspect of urban science. My third aspect really relates to the system, the environment, that in some senses, the systems approach assumed that we could divide a system into the system itself and a relatively passive environment that could be considered stable and fairly sort of fairly non-volatile in that sense. It turns out, in fact, that we've learned this over the last 50 years or longer, that most of the systems we deal with are exceptionally difficult to separate the system from the environment. This is particularly true about growing cities in this particular context. And for example, it changes our model. So here I show an example of Greater London divided into 33 boroughs on the left-hand side, and then into 670, then into about 2,000, and finally England and Wales divided into about 7,000 zones. And the same model, the same gravitational type models are built for these different systems. And there are, we really need to explore the instabilities that take place, the sensitivities, as we actually change the zoning system. Now, none of this is new, but it's really very significant in terms of urban science in that sense. The old model where we can think of the environment as being passive in some sense is really not the way to go in some respects. So I'm going to stop at that point. I should say there are lots of other themes that I could talk about, and they're going to come up this afternoon. This evening, I should say. And there are three books that John mentioned, my own book, New Science of Cities in 2013, but Bartholomew's book, and then more recently, Louis Betancourt's book, all of these really deal with, I suppose, the first part of what we saw, what I introduced really, not so much cellular automata or boundaries are there basically, but scaling in some sense and gravitational models. I should actually say that none of this sort of stuff has really been put together in a kind of coherent theory in some sense, which is remarkable. Probably the person who's done most for this is Waldo Tobler. In many papers, of course, he examined these things that we're talking about in terms of urban science. Let me stop at that point and just leave you with the picture of the half dozen or so, or a bit more, maybe 8 or 10 contributions to the urban science section of the Urban Informatics book. Now, I'm probably way over time, basically, so I'll stop sharing my screen and hand back to our host, John. Okay, there we go.
Thank you very much, Professor Batty, for introducing urban science. Now, after that, let's turn to the urban big data infrastructure to be introduced by Professor Michael Goodchild. Professor Goodchild, please.
Thank you, John, and good morning. I'm speaking from California, where it's 5 a.m. And I want to talk a little bit about big data and talk about it from three aspects. And these are, of course, the three V's, which we often associate with big data, because in an urban context, big data raises issues of multiple sources, that's variety. Also near real time, which is velocity, and also abundance, which is volume. And I want to ask the question then in the next few minutes of what does all of that, what are those three defining characteristics of big data mean for a research journal such as the one that we're developing? So I want to make 6 points quite quickly. And these are 6 chosen for personal reasons. I'm not suggesting that these are the only 6 in any way, or even that they're the most important 6, but they do, to me, capture the questions that I really think are important to ask in the context of big data infrastructure for urban informatics. So the first question is data integration, because if you have data coming from many, many different sources, it will be coming in different formats, which are essentially interoperable, not interoperable. And so I want to suggest that there are three ways in which we can go about the question of integration. And notice that this has to happen because of volume. It has to happen with enormous volumes of data. And it also has to happen quickly because we want to be able to manage the city in near real time. So first option is to use location as the integrating indicator. And this is what we very often do. We assemble data based on reference to common locations. This then reflects my own interest, which is geospatial interest. And I want to talk a little bit about the accuracy issue, because...
Pardon my interruption, Mr. Goodchild. Could you share your screen, please? If you...
I'm not going to show slides.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay. So accuracy is an issue. And when it comes to GPS, we have to remember that it's virtually impossible to resolve a GPS location to identify the floor that a person is on in a building. GPS is often corrupted by tall buildings. It's often corrupted by poor signals in urban areas. And it then becomes extremely difficult to say where someone is rather than a pair of coordinates where someone is in the context of a point of interest. And even more difficult then to define who someone is with based on two observations based on GPS. We have alternative technologies, so we have Bluetooth, which may be more efficient for determining who someone is with. And we have Wi-Fi and other technologies for urban, for interior location. But nevertheless, accuracy will always be a major problem if one wishes to use location as the integrating mechanism. Notice also that increasingly time is part of that same method of integration, because we want to find out whether we can integrate data based on space and time, where something happens and when it happens. And then the third possibility is to use some unique identifier. So we integrate data based on a person's name or other unique identifiers. And very commonly what is used here is the device ID, the IP address. Because it's assumed that when we're dealing with the same device, we're dealing with the same person. That, of course, raises enormous issues of data privacy, which are bound to be major issues of urban big data infrastructure. It also raises issues of who controls the data. Can we achieve something like personal control, a person having control of his or her own data? Because, of course, in the current situation, control of data is all too often in the hands of third parties, particularly large corporations. My second issue is then the accuracy issue, which I've already referred to a little already, because we really have to ask whether the data that we have available for some piece of analysis, some piece of research, some decision making, whether the data are sufficiently accurate to be fit for use. And a major example there has been, in the past few months, the use of GPS for contact tracing, where the inability to be accurate about the third dimension and the inability to be accurate about a point of interest has been a major issue, and has led really to the unraveling of many efforts at contact tracing using location. The third point concerns data ownership. And this is, of course, at the present time, data ownership is an extremely complicated issue with data being fragmented over many different ownership, different corporations, different government agencies. And we've seen this happen recently with increasing attention to what might be termed ping data. These are the pings, the observations that certain devices were at certain locations at particular times. And the recognition that ping data, which is now available in massive quantities, is being assembled, aggregated, and resold for marketing purposes. And of course, part of this comes from the reluctance of people to carefully consider the terms and conditions of use of various apps, so that it's all too easy for the developer of an app to harvest ping data from the users of that app and to aggregate it, integrate it, and resell it. So the open question there surely is how to regulate. How should we regulate ping data, the acquisition of ping data, the reselling of ping data? And there I have to say that Europe is well ahead of the United States in the passing of regulations over ping data. My fourth issue is the location of computing, and John has already referred to this briefly. The question here is, where should we compute? Should we compute at the sensor? So what sort of processing should occur at the sensor itself? And an example there is the use of filtering for GPS data. So what we often see as GPS data is quite heavily filtered and adjusted by the GPS device itself. Should we compute in the drone? Should we compute in the satellite? And the very open question as to the scale of geographic aggregation of computing. Should we think of computing for an entire metropolitan area, all of Hong Kong? Or should it be broken down into constituent parts? In Los Angeles, for example, should we be thinking about computing at the level of the municipality? Because there are many municipalities, almost 100 municipalities in the county of Los Angeles. And in many cases, this is a matter of serendipity. It's a matter of chance as to where the computing occurs. It may be a legacy of earlier times. Our arrangements for computing the massive big data infrastructure often date from previous arrangements and previous political decisions. And then I want to talk a little bit about edge computing, because edge computing asks the question again, where should we compute? And there are many possible solutions which are very different from the kinds of traditional solutions that we've had. And then finally, I want to say something briefly about the long-term impacts of big data infrastructure, because I think any research on big data infrastructure needs to consider those long-term impacts. And I'm thinking here of the kinds of communication networks. If we're thinking about mobility in a city, we need to be thinking not only about mobility of vehicles and mobility of people, but also mobility of information. And the networks that are used to communicate information are very much part of big data infrastructure and raise numerous questions about how to organize the networks, how to develop them further, how to avoid relying on networks that are legacies of past arrangements. And if we were to go a little bit further, perhaps we should go into the impacts of big data infrastructure on land use. What kinds of changes are coming in the city as a result of the development of big data infrastructure? And I'm thinking of changes of retailing land use, which are right now very dramatic. Changes in urban freight arrangements, in delivery and logistics. So many implications of big data infrastructure in the longer term. So there's just 6 points which I thought were worth drawing out. And as I said at the beginning, these are very much a personal list. And I'd invite you to develop your own ideas of what are the key points surrounding the development of big data infrastructure in cities. So thank you very much for your attention. John, you're muted.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Goodchild, and for your big points on spatial big data infrastructure, which I think forms a very important infrastructure for the future urban development. So having addressed urban science, urban big data infrastructure by Professor Batty from UCL, Professor Goodchild from UC Santa Barbara. Now let's invite Professor Mei-Po Kwan from CUHK and about urban systems and applications. Just before that, may I announce we have about over 13,000 audience from WeChat, about how many? About 3,000 from Bilibili and 150 from YouTube. So probably later on we will have more. So I'm very glad many people shows their interest on urban informatics. Then let's continue. Mei-Po, please. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, John. Thank you, everybody, for coming. So I talk about urban systems and applications using new information technologies and data on urban issues. The applications include, for example, in the book of Urban Informatics about human mobility and travel, urban fleet systems, urban resilience and disaster response, urban crime, urban governance, the use of remote sensing for environmental modeling, health and well-being, and urban energy system. In the interest of time, I can only talk about two, human mobility and travel, and health and well-being, which I'm very familiar with. Human mobility and travel in the past, or traditionally use travel survey data for the management and planning of data infrastructure and facilities, but they are costly and also time consuming to collect. But the sample size of the travel surveys are often limited when compared to the source of urban big data, for example, mobile phone data and point of interest data. So much recent work also use various types of geospatial big data, for example, mobile phone data, taxi trajectory data, to examine human mobility patterns. So I'll show one example of my work with Jung-Wan Kim in this paper. We look into the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on people's mobility using big mobile phone data, and it's a longitudinal studies of the US and looking into two waves, of the pandemic's impact on the human mobility. So with mobile phone data, we have individual daily travel trajectories captured by the phone record, and then we are actually, reconstructing, how they move daily, and looking into the maximum distance from home to any daily activities, and then so we average the people selected in the county, and then looking into the medium of the county. For example, we have, in Cook County, 5 kilometer. Cook County is in Illinois, in the United States. So we run, like 6 longitudinal model, but this is, in the interest of time, I'm only going to talk about the key finding, which is actually when people first have the pandemic, they drop their mobility and very quickly move up. Yeah, so no time to talk about this modeling result. But in the second wave, it goes up, even though the COVID-19 cases went also up. So you may expect that the mobility would decrease, but it's not. So it probably is based on the quarantine fatigue or the perceived reduced risk. So the summary is that the first decrease but soon recover, a strong V-shaped result in many variables were found also in Hong Kong and New Zealand, and not only the United States, meaning that people like actually get tired of, like they will reduce their mobility due to the very strict policy, but they will very quickly resume. So this policy will only be effective for a certain time. So what I want to show in this small example is that from using big mobile phone and mobility data, that we are able to associate with, how effective the policy of COVID-19 on human mobility. And then thus, of course, implication is for the spread of the pandemic, control of the virus. And then also, the second topic that I want to, talk and focus on talking in my very a few minutes of talk. So it's a health and well-being. The innovative method for collecting individual data for examining health and well-being of urban residents. For example, we can do mobile sensing, we can do tracking, GPS tracking, and the machine learning in combination of a multi-source geospatial big data and also travel diary, and also a lot of new innovative technology can be a very fruitful direction. So I would say one key thing is that we want to measure very accurately the environment. However, the exposure always does not mean that it's causally related to the health outcome. And then this is related to, one of the possibilities is the uncertain geographic context problem, which is a very major methodological challenge because we may not identify the space and time correctly, and then thus, lead to erroneous results. So how to delineate the contextual unit in space and time is very important. So we build in many cities, smart city environment, sensing system using multi-source, for example, remote sensing, street views, using the innovative street views LiDAR and monitoring stations, POI, land use. And then we also combine it with the real-time personal monitoring by people carrying devices looking into the trajectory, the air quality and sound meters to the every seconds. And then we want to build the exposure assessment related to the health outcome. So basically we have developed devices, methodology, very complicated with, geospatial big data set and also personal sensing in many cities. And then we're also looking into every second, there's air pollution differences and also associated with the GPS tracking and space-time and activity diary and also noise level every second. And also we have ecological, the momentary, the moment, at the moment, how do they feel about everything? So not everything, but so we have a particular, set of questions. So what do we have is that then every second we got, GPS, we have people's movement, and then also we correct it using multi-source methodology. And then we have, people, experiencing different exposure over time in their residence and also when they're moving around. But we also have the people carrying, that means that we have that particular, time, that how the environmental sensing. So we need to compare all of this, right? And see and identify the causally relevant geographic context. And then, in the interest of time, I'm going to say a few things that is, important, that using all this urban informatics to do health and well-being. First of all, I talk about the resident space, right? People experiencing different air pollution over time. However, when people moving around, this is also very different. We found significant difference in terms of this kind of exposure. And what is more important is that when people just looking into the resident space measurement, and also even though we map the trajectory in the monitoring station estimation, they're pretty similar, but it's very different when we have people carrying the devices every second. They're very different air pollution exposure, especially related to their activities at night. So what you can ask us, why do we know what do they do? And then it's because we also collect the activity travel diary at the same time. So this person has higher every second personal air pollution exposure because she was cooking at home. Noise exposure also, outdoor, indoor, we can distinguish that. Outdoor are higher than indoor, and also in cumulatively, the indoor-outdoor noise exposure cumulatively has a significant negative effect on mental health. I promise you causal relationship, right? So this is not just association, this is causal model. And in another causal model that we find that we hypothesize the momentary, that is at the moment, the noise, the Van Bay measure would have momentary psychological stress, but we cannot find a statistically significant relationship. However, in our causal model, when we have the mediated, mediating variable, momentarily perceived the noise, how people perceive whether it's a construction noise very annoying, or whether this is actually a ganbei, happy banquet kind of noise. Then when we see actually measure the perceived noise mediated by this variable, we found significant causal relationship to momentarily psychological stress, which is a very important factor to many disease, health outcome. So in summary, I mean, of course, I can go on and on. We can do heights, and then we can, but I think that, in summary, that we are increasingly having widely available data. And this is useful for helping us to understand the many specific urban system. Information technology and everyday device, when connected to the internet, can help urban residents access to health and sense information. But just like my Goodchild mentioned, the ethical, privacy, and confidentiality issue related to the use of the sensitive data can be, needs to be discussed. And, the funding sources, acknowledgement in the past 2 years, and especially the RGC, collaborated research fund. And then also this is our research institute at night, quite beautiful. You're all welcome to visit us one day. Thank you. Stop sharing.
Yeah, thank you, Mei-Po, on your views on the urban systems and applications, in particular on health applications, which is very important. And for today, we're facing the COVID-19 pandemic. Mm-hmm. Yeah, next, let's move to the urban sensing. May I invite Professor Carlo Ratti from MIT, and to share his view on urban sensing. Carlo, are you ready?
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, John. And and Mei-Po, love your building. So anyway, I'll share some slides here. I just wanted to tell I have just a very quick message here. So, and this is part, by the way, we had this conversation with Mike Batty, with you, John, with a few others. And so my suggestion is that we might do a joint forces and try to look at this question. And the question is very simple, is what is a city? And so some ideas for city delineation using cell phone data. And by the way, what I'm presenting here is some work that has been done, for instance, by Lei Dong, who's been a postdoc in our lab at MIT, by Vincent Vervatz, Paolo, myself, but also, part of a broader conversation. Now, what is the problem? Clearly, the problem is very simply said is that we are talking a lot about the science of cities, but we don't have a clear definition of what a city is, at least in a numerical definition. And as you all know, there's different definitions in different countries. MSAs, for instance, the US, FUAs in the EU and OECD, but if you look at them, they're quite different. You see down there. Even if they're based usually on a similar principle, you define a core, you look at people commuting to the core, and by doing that, you define the extent of the metropolitan area or the city. But even if the principle is similar, we get very different results, as you can see in this image. And so really the question is, the current definitions are not consistent, and they require very good information on mobility. We heard about this before, just a few minutes before. And then also deciding what type of threshold we want to use in order to define the full extent of the city. So there's a spelling mistake here, but in existing attempts to delineate cities, so with big data, there have been a few new approaches proposed. Some of them we can call them morphological. So looking at population and looking at continuous cluster of high population, built up area or density, or some of them functional, again, looking at all the exchanges in a certain area. And I'll be a bit quick on this, provided we agree on what the parameters should be of a good city definition. Our hypothesis is that if we join forces, we could really try to agree and converge on a definition that then we can be used in a standardized way across the planet. Clearly, we need to meet certain objectives. We need to have data that's universal, easy to access, and self-explanatory. We probably need to mix both morphological and functional features. Then, in order to be universal, we need a definition that's parameter-free. All parameters then endogenous. And then we should have a simple way to validate such a definition. So some kind of quantitative criteria to assess it. And it seems to us that big cell phone data big data from cell phone is quite interesting. The infrastructure for a cell phone is the same all over the world, and it can help us to collect that information, both about population and about mobility. So we got both of them collected in a standardized way or across the planet. If you think about 4G or 5G or 3G, whatever, we have the uniform way to collect this all over the world. And so, as we say, it's ubiquitous. It mixes morphological features, its functional features, and it has already been used a little bit. So actually I want to share this. The first one to the left, that's communication networks in general, is an article we did with Stephen Strogatz a few years ago, looking at regions in the UK based on what was at the time the largest ever made network of communications. What you see there is some other work, more recent work, again on delineation. What you see here is some work we've been doing over the past year or so. Lei, in particular, has been doing, Lei Dong, looking at China and again using cell phone data to identify regions in China. And so somehow, I'm saying all this because I think we all need a good, clear, simple, universal definition of cities. And perhaps if we get together, I thought it was a good moment today to discuss this. If we get together, if we pull together forces, we could get to this definition and hopefully speed up developments in city science. So that was my kind of 5 minutes, and I look forward to the conversation.
Okay, thank you, Carlo. Yes, I think you address a very fundamental issue, definition of city or urban. I think especially from urban sensing point of view, from say, for example, mobile phone data. So I think that's one way we see the city or definition from different view. Now, let's next move to urban computing. May we invite Professor Eric Miller from University of Toronto. Yes, Eric, please. Yeah.
Thank you, John, and thank you very much for inviting me to join in this session. Yes, so I'm going to talk about my task was urban computing. I think I'm going to come at that, first of all, I'm a transportation systems analyst modeler, so I'm going to be speaking specifically within transportation. I think my talk overlaps a bit, extends Mei-Po's in many respects, and I think she set a good stage for me. But before I talk about computing per se, I want to observe that urban informatics technology is and has been transforming transportation in a wide variety of ways. And this is extremely important in very practical operation ways. The system is changing. So the transportation system behavior is changing, both on the supply side in terms of the new services that are being enabled by informatics that are coming on stream and the system performance itself. And then informatics is influencing actual travel behavior. And all of this, of course, raises a huge challenge to people like myself who are modelers and analysts and policy people in terms of coping coping with this disruption that's happening. But in addition to that, informatics itself is changing the way we can do modeling, the way we can do analysis. We've already heard several examples of that today, both in terms of the data available for modeling, and Mei-Po has talked a bit about that, and also in terms of enabling different modeling methods. So first of all, just let's remind ourselves that we are in an era of new technology and services, various ride-hailing, ride-sharing services, demand responsive transit, and of course then connected autonomous and electric vehicles are coming along. All of this is being enabled by the information technologies that have been developed. I mean, you know, taxis have been with us forever, but ride-hailing, Uber and Lyft type services are fundamentally new because of the computing platforms and the analytics and the data available to support this new kind of taxi service. Similarly, we've talked about demand responsive transit since at least the 1960s, but now again the platforms and technologies available to us are truly transforming what we can be doing on the transit side. And of course, one of the big challenges is how can we merge these things together, and where is transit going in particular in this brave new era of technology. Similarly, for a long time, we've been, as long as the digital computer's been around, we've been trying to use information technology to help improve control of our network operations, particularly on the road side, but also the transit side. That these capabilities are growing all the time, particularly in terms of using cameras and other sensor devices to give us real-time information about the system. The challenge, I think, is still how do we, most effectively control the system. I think one thing that we haven't thought enough about from a research point of view is how are all the route guidance apps that people are using all the time actually affecting travel behavior and hence feeding back on performance. I think two areas where we see some use of informatics, but I think we could do much more, is both in terms of road pricing and controlling and pricing parking. We have the technology, really, we could be pricing every kilometer of travel of all cars and parking by location and time of day if we wanted to. Again, maybe there's government control issues there, but again, the potential is very large. But now turning to travel behavior, again, real-time travel information systems are I think having a big impact on how people travel, their route choices, their mode choices, their location choices. Where should I park? Where should I go for a restaurant? And so we've seen real changes in behavior there that I think, again, from a modeling point of view, are challenging to deal with. The pandemic has introduced the term working from home as a universal label concept. How will that change cities? How will it change travel behavior over time? This is one of the very big questions going forward, both from a modeling point of view and a policy point of view. Again, online commerce, e-shopping has been with us for some time, but it's exploded through the pandemic. And I would say both in terms of working from home and online commerce, thank goodness we had the informatics systems that we had. Just imagine if we'd had the pandemic even 10 years ago, when we didn't have the sort of Zoom type platforms that we have today, how would we have managed? And of course, we have this emerging so-called metaverse. What will be that impact on travel? We really don't know. And so turning more formally to, or more explicitly to computing, transportation systems analysis, and I would say all urban systems analysis, is a child of the digital computer. We didn't have travel demand models when we had slide rules and so forth. As with, I think, with urban science in general, it is the computer that has allowed us to both gather the data and analyze the data and build, high-end models, simulations of cities that are allowing us to understand cities, understand transportation in particular, in ways that just would not exist without the computer. So what we do and the evolution in my own field of travel demand modeling is tied directly to the computing capabilities, both hardware and software and data that we have available to us, and we could write a history of that. it has already been discussed. You know, the modern informatics are not only you know, changing the way the system actually works and the way we sense the system and control it, but it's providing us as modelers and analysts enormous new data sets with which we can observe the city, observe the transportation system, and change the way we do modeling. And Mei-Po has already done a great introduction to, you know, examples of how we can be using the data to ask new questions, look at things in new ways. So I won't talk, I'll come back to that in just a second, a couple of examples. But I do want to just say say one or two things about modeling. In particular, the use of the computer and the detailed data sets available to us to construct what I think are very powerful agent-based microsimulation models. An agent-based model, an agent is an intelligent actor in the system. They perceive the world around them. They make decisions. They act in the world. It's you and us. It's firms. It's you know, this is what in travel modeling. This is what we're trying to model, is the behavior of people, the behavior of agents. An agent-based microsimulation allows this to get down to the level of actual behavior, an individual, groups of individuals, and we can look at how they interact with each other. We can introduce history and memory and learning and adaptation potentially, because we're tracking the agent through time and through their experience. And we can model the complexity of behavior in transportation. We really need to be looking at how people organize their entire day and put things together. And this is really only possible through a disaggregated microsimulation type approach. And again, it's only possible to do within advanced computing. And just as one example of this, we've spent a lot of time building travel demand models in the Toronto region, agent-based microsimulation models, which are actually in operational use in the cities. And with this disaggregated approach, we're able to build very, very sophisticated, I would say, models of tour-based mode choice. That my choice of how I travel to work in the morning is dependent on what else I'm doing during the day. And so that's dependent on my interactions with other people during the day. Maybe I have to take my child to daycare, so I can't take transit because I can only do that by car and so forth. And so the ABM approach allows us to represent that complexity, but actually in quite simple ways. And what we found through this approach is we're modeling very complex behavior with relatively simple models. And I see my time is pretty much up already, but just as a couple of other examples of using new data, I think an interesting study we did in Montevideo, we had both cell phone data, the cell tower trace data, we had transit smart card data, and we had a traditional, quite good but small travel survey data. And we actually developed data fusion methods to try to bring together all these data sets to impute travel modes, attach travel modes to cell phone data, which is actually quite a challenging task. And then another example, a COVID-19 example, we've already heard some talks about that. A big question in Toronto, and I think other places, we hear a lot about people moving out of the city and moving to more suburban or even rural locations for more space and so forth. And so certainly we see, you know, and one of the surprises, at least in Toronto, was retail activity, residential location activity actually went up during the pandemic. More people were on the move. We saw that trend. But in terms of the spatial distribution of where people were moving in, this is the Toronto region, and moving out, here's downtown Toronto, it was actually a much more balanced pattern. And in particular, if we look in downtown Toronto, and this is all with cell phone data where we're looking at changes in home locations, we see that on, you know, on balance, about as many people moved into the downtown as moved out. So I think this is just yet one more example of how you know, informatics data can help us dig deeply into the behaviors and issues of the day. And so that's the end of my little presentation. I'll turn it back to you, John.
Thank you very much, Eric. Yeah, for the urban computing part. So now we, after we have a talk on this this part. Now next, let's move to the roundtable discussion, because I believe we will have a lot more discussions and questions Then may I invite all our speakers turn on your camera. So Professor Batty. And then, so for the roundtable discussion, we have another two guests. One is Professor Anthony Ye from Hong Kong U. Yeah. And also, may I also invite Professor Yue from Shenzhen University. Yeah. Yes. Okay. Welcome. Yes. So that we all now panel members for this roundtable discussion. Because Professor Ye and Professor Yue didn't talk before, so before the round table discussion starts, may I invite Professor Ye to say a few words, if you could. Yeah.
Thank you very much, John, for organizing this very interesting webinar, which actually we have big speakers here with the two mics, Carlo, Mei-Po, John, you, and also Eric, right? This is very great. I enjoy the presentation very much, which also can give us the more or less the state of the art of what you guys are doing, right? And anyway, I just want to give my 2 cents. So the first cent is that basically when we are talking about, recently I'm looking at MAS, the mobility as a service. And we are interested to know about, as a geographer and also as a planner, is about what we used to call spatial variation, right? And nowadays, a new term called spatial heterogeneity, which I just learned, right? Of the demand and also the supply side. But obviously, the demand is also very according to social areas, this spatial structure itself. And the demand is just like what Michael Goodchild has been talking about, is the urban infrastructure, and obviously it varies according to the different locations. You may have a much higher, denser type of sensor in the city, whereas you have less dense. But this is something that I think is important, so that we can provide better type of services to places somehow these are being disadvantaged because of the they do not have enough demand and also did not supply, and people have to wait a long time. And so how can we resolve this? Obviously, there are a lot of things that need to be done. Now, the other sense is basically about the urban infrastructure itself, and how are we going to make use of, we used to call PPP for data type of supply or provision, which you call public-private partnership, right? Just like the Google Map is a very good example of these public-private partnerships, right? Or the Google Travel. Okay. Now, but actually, we should extend this not only to the 3P, we may be calling to be 5P, including, for example, the politics, the pricing, and the privacy. So it's altogether 6 Ps, right? And how they interact in order to provide this type of data for us to do all these type of nice things that we can do. And so this is also related back to also the spatial variation of this demand and supply, and how are we going to make use of this type of 6 Ps in order to provide the infrastructure. So there's a lot of things happening that are worth our attentions. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Ye. Professor Yue Yang, you want to say a few words?
Okay. Actually, I'm here to present Professor Li Qingquan. He is busy. So I will throw out a question about AI, because every field is talking about AI. So how about the role of AI in our urban informatics? Although machine learning methods have been widely used in our urban sensing and our urban modeling process, which improve the efficiency and accuracy, but we are merely reused the existing method and have limited new findings and deeper insight to our domain knowledge. On the contrary, for example, in the field of bioinformatics or cheminformatics, for instance, the AI actually have made some significant breakthroughs, such as they found new materials or new structures. So in our urban informatics field, do we have such room or breakthrough that need to be solved by AI? From my point of view, first, we do not have enough data or such data infrastructure to support the training of AI models, especially when dealing with humans, as Goodchild said that privacy issue, which also provides the data sharing and also data labeling, which is necessary for machine learning. And also data bias could lead to the bias of the results. And the second point is that for the time being, AI do not have enough intelligence to deal with our urban space, which is a result of many complex issues and also uncertainties such as economic, cultural, history, and politics, of course. So what can we expect from AI? Or the key points in the human-involved topics that AI can contribute to our domain knowledge. Okay, this is the question from my side. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Yue. Yeah. Okay, I think today this is the first webinar on urban informatics. We well received. Right now, I'm told we have over 20,000 audience from a different platform. So I think that shows a strong interest on urban informatics. So now we're starting. That's new.
John, you're a rock star.
Thank you. We're urban informatics researcher. So I think we start to think how we start as urban informatics. What will be the area be covered by urban informatics? What will be the way we go from here for the long-term development of urban informatics? Like many disciplines, they have started. The early times, I remember Professor Goodchild, Professor Batty, they started the GI science. Then for the development, that's the discipline. Now we start another new discipline, urban informatics. So what will be what will be the way we should go, and from the start today and then later on for the development. So I think that's all the questions we should consider here. So maybe we invite each of our panel members to give you views on how to develop urban informatics. If you could give you views. Professor Goodchild, you had an experience to develop a GI science. Now
sure.
Another new science.
Sure. Well, I think that Professor Ratti has also already raised the question of defining the city. And I think one thing we have to bear in mind in developing a journal is that cities are not isolated. They're not well-bounded, and they interact with their surrounding hinterlands. They also interact with each other as a network. And so I think it would be foolish of us to rule out papers for this journal that look at a city in the context of its surroundings, and let me simply suggest this, that we should not ban the word rural from our journal, but instead consider cities in their surrounding context. I thought the question that Professor Yu raised about AI was very interesting. What can we expect from AI? And at the moment, I think we are somewhere caught between a view that AI is the answer to everything, and on the other hand, some very deep and well-founded skepticism about the power of AI. So I think if there is one question that this journal can help to resolve, it is that question. What exactly can we expect from AI? And not just in the short term, but also in the longer term. And there are many, many different perspectives on that question. which I think the journal should welcome, because it is, I think, in many ways the question of the moment, given the popularity of AI, the expansion of AI, and the potential power of AI. So I suggest that we make that one of our key questions in developing this journal.
Thank you, Professor. Yeah, Professor Batty, your views.
Okay, there's no question that urban informatics is very strongly related to computing in many senses. Eric made the point several times about the impact of computing on our field, and we all recognize that what we've talked about today wouldn't really exist in a form without the digital computer in this sense. So it seems to me that is something that should occupy. Sorry about this. Somebody phoning me from somewhere. What we should do in the journal is we should address this question of computing, because computing is so all-embracing, having such an enormous impact on us. I mean, for example, here I am sitting in, well, I'm actually sitting in the town of Bath, but my background is the Bank of England, basically, and I don't know where everybody is in this sense. So this is a major impact of computing on location and space. And I think we have to address that. There are several aspects that spin off that we've not really talked about. To some extent, it's implicit. The high frequency city versus the low frequency city is a very important issue. The extent to which the kind of information that we get by second by second, minute by minute behaviors and so on, how this relates to how cities are changing over a much longer period. Many of these issues really relate to how we might integrate different sorts of tools and techniques and methods and theories from one domain to another in that sense. So I think that needs to be addressed, this question about computing. And how we do it, because it is so all-pervasive, it's very difficult to know how to do it in the context of the journal. It seems to me that we need to push that more, and it does embrace some of these other questions, such as the impact of AI and the impact of a whole range of things in terms of how our behaviors are being impacted by the use of information technologies.
Thank you. May I hear views from Professor Carlo, Ratti? And I understand that in MIT you very look at the urban science and computer science together very seriously. So you come with new program. It's urban science together with the computer science. So that's basically urban informatics. So from your point of view, particular,
Thank you, John. I wanted to add to what was just mentioned a moment ago. I also think it would be very, very interesting to define the perimeter of where AI can play a role. So it'll be certainly interesting defining the question. Also, AI is a very broad term. It is changing a lot. You know, we get new techniques and we get new applications. And so from our point of view, we see a lot of interest in AI today in at least two things. The first one is that as we all know, there's a lot of research that was done since the 1960s and 70s on looking at the visual appearance of cities. I'm thinking about people such as Alan Jacobs or Kevin Lynch and similar, or William White in the US. And now all of the type of analysis can be done in an unprecedented way because you got a huge amount of visual imagery. And again, AI can help us to classify it. So somehow we see a lot of interest there in classifying, understanding the city, the visual image of the city in a digital way. And also something interesting that's probably at the beginning, but is how do we start from, say, a LiDAR scan of a very complex urban environment. We are trying this, for instance, in favelas at the moment in the global south. So favelas are very, very complex, artifacts. You cannot apply the traditional way to describe a city to a favela. And then if you look at all this kind of visual imagery plus LiDAR, how can we use AI to extract semantics that then becomes the basis for adding information? For instance, if you add a sensor, you in a favela, you cannot just use, even if you had lat long in a very precise way, that is not enough. It's such a complex environment. that you need to attach it to some kind of semantic structure that you need to extract, and AI can help. So we're seeing a lot of interest in here, but we're seeing a lot of potential future applications here. But it seems to me that really focusing on the perimeter of AI, where AI can help in looking at new techniques as they develop, how they can change urban science. It seems to me that could be a very important question for all of us.
Thank you very much. Now let's start to take up questions from audience. The first question here I received here is, will smarter transportation based on that information be safer? I guess that's a question from Professor Miller. So if Eric can answer that question. Thank you.
Well, let's hope so. Yes, it should be. I mean, certainly in terms of autonomous vehicles, this is one of the major claims for autonomous vehicles, is they will be much safer. I think that's something, and they probably will be up to a point, but they will never. No technological system is totally fail-safe, and so I think. And the basic kind of physics of people on streets is not going to change that much. So I think it will make for a safer system, but not, there will still be accidents, there'll still be technology failures, and so forth. So I think, consistent with a lot of the discussion, we have to sort out the hype from the reality and of what AI, smart cities, smart transportation can do. I think there are real benefits, but there will still be accidents. There'll still be issues to deal with. There'll still be congestion. AI is not going to get rid of congestion in very large cities like Hong Kong or Toronto or anywhere else, but it will help.
Yeah, thank you. There's another question. I think this is for Professor Goodchild. Will an individual control all her information?
I'm sorry, what's the word?
Yeah, the question is, will an individual control all her or his information?
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful dream, an ideal. And I suspect that it is in practice not attainable. It would be lovely if I could walk around with a thumb drive around my neck, which contained all of the information about me and gave me power to deny access to my thumb drive as I wished. That, unfortunately, I think is not going to happen. I think there are some instances of information that we do in fact control, and I've always thought that the one item of information that I actually control is my CV, which I am solely responsible for maintaining, and I would love that to be extensible. I've in the past compiled information about, for example, my own travel. But it's a lot of work to do that, and I suspect that other people, some of the large IT companies, in fact do a better job. Yeah, this is something that colleagues have referred to as the balkanization of the quantified self, implying that the quantitative information about the individual, about me, is maintained in many, many different places under many, many different guises, and assembling it all together is going to continue to be extremely difficult. So yes, a wonderful dream, but in practice, probably unattainable.
John, you have unmute yourself.
Okay. So the next question is how is urban informatics different from GIS or geoinformatics? So I invite Professor Batty to answer that question, and also Professor Goodchild or supplement more. Okay, yeah.
I'll leave my Goodchild to deal with GI science, because I wasn't responsible for that at all. But back to the beginning of the NCGIA. Well, in many senses, what is new and what is old really is quite an interesting question when it comes to different branding, different movements, and so on. And to some extent, I think that the reason why we define things in the way we did, and the reason why we selected a variety of chapters in the book on urban informatics, and if we take urban informatics as being what's in the book basically at this particular point, I know that we need to be a bit more a bit tighter than that really, but in terms of what's in the book basically, they seem to be important perspectives which had sort of linked to what was going on already within thinking about tools and techniques and models for cities, and also the development of new information technologies. Sensing is a classic example. So we've seen a lot of those. So I think it's a question of degree. It's not a new field per se, really. It's a rebranding, and we do this all the time. And I don't have any apologies for it. We do this all the time because, you know, things are developing, things change in that sense. So, but I do think that, as I said before, that computing is pretty central to urban informatics in this particular context. I think you could write a lot of what was written in the book and change the emphasis in some sense. Obviously, some things in the book are very much to do with computing in that sense, but I think there's a lot in the book that really relates to you know, what's been going on in urban studies and transportation and fields of that sort and so on. That's not a very satisfactory answer, because it's not an answer at all in terms of what is urban informatics. I mean, I think we'd be hard pressed to define it per se, like many of these things. I'm going to ask Mike to follow that.
Well, let me say that I think if there is a definition of GIS, and that's a major question, it is the location, the geospatial aspect, which is critical. And so to find examples where urban informatics differs from GIS, all we have to do is find examples of urban informatics that don't involve location. And of course, there are many, many examples. So many databases which are undoubtedly part of urban informatics don't contain location data. So for example, data on individuals where the actual location of that individual is not recorded, immediately give us an example. So many, many examples, I think, and we have to think of and I think there is a danger here in assuming that geospatial is a key part of urban informatics, and thereby ignoring areas where geospatial is not critical. And that's something that people on the outside will often accuse GIS of fetishizing the importance of location.
John, you are muted. John.
Okay. Yes. Any other comments from our panel members here?
No, I think when we talk about urban informatics, one of the new directions, I think will be actually is already here, but somehow may not have enough discussion. It's about how we can work together with what is known as digital twins, right? And that is basically related to, for example, like safety issues, right? And so with the interactions of the cyberspace and also with the real space, by using the sensors as some sort of a bridge, we should be able to make the city at least more efficient, much safer. For example, like, you know, if we are talking about traffic, right? Obviously, in the old days, we can't use this to control the traffic lights, right? So this is basically digital twins in operation for a long time. But I think it's go beyond that. For example, like the environment, and if we find that there's a lot of you know, pollution, and we may want to somehow give warnings and do some sort of different things, right? And I think this will be some sort of the application sides of urban informatics. Now, for the journal itself, I just want to maybe give some suggestions. Maybe you can join and organize some special issues so people can really concentrate and focus on certain area, the state of the art, and just continue the book, basically. Because the book is also containing the different chapters on the state of the art, which is, I think, my students find it very useful. Because 2 years ago, we have started this master degree of urban analytics. This is the 3rd year now we are recruiting students. And it seems to be quite popular because a lot of students want to learn this new technique in analyzing the data that we now collected, although we are not really urban informatics, but part of urban informatics. But I think that is a lot of, in the next 10 years, it reminds me just like Mike Goodchild, when they were talking about urban geoinformation science, right? Mike, you still remember we have a discussion in Carlo, right? In the IGU spatial data handling.